Tēnā koutou. For those who don't know me, my name's David Murdoch. I'm the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Otago, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to celebrate Patricia Priest's promotion to Professor. This is one of the great pleasures of my role to be involved in these events, which are great celebrations. And as you may be aware, we've had quite a lot of disruption with our inaugural professorial lectures over the past few years because of COVID, and we've been furiously catching up this year, and we've been doing rather well at getting on top of the large number of inaugural professorial lectures. And I think, Trish, probably 2 or 3 false starts, I think. 2 false starts, so well done, we've got here finally, and wonderful to be here to celebrate the event. My role is mainly one to welcome everyone, and it's wonderful to see so many people here today. We're also online, so welcome to everyone who is watching live or watching later on. Big welcome. I know there'll be quite a number. And I do want to welcome some special guests here today, particularly Tricia's whānau and friends. So I know we have Tricia's mother, Audrey, is with us today, husband Hugh, and children Ella, Izzy and Arlo. So big welcome to you. I think your sister Julia may be watching online, so big welcome to you, Julia. And I know there are a number of friends, some who have come from out of town, so I do want to acknowledge Kerry, Joni, Hans and Susan who have travelled here today. There may be others, but big welcome to you all. Trish, Joe's going to give a bit of a bio sketch, a little bit of a background to your career. But before that, I'd just like to make a few comments if I can. And we've known each other a long time, so I'm actually not going to say very much because I might be stealing some thunder for your talk. So I'm actually going to restrict what I'm going to say. But I am going to just comment. As you no doubt know, Tricia's an epidemiologist, and not so long ago, as in 2 or 3 years ago, most people didn't know what an epidemiologist is or does, let alone pronounce epidemiology. And that's COVID has certainly changed that, and ended up with virtually every health professional being called an epidemiologist, and including myself occasionally. I sense the tide may be turning a bit because I saw some merchandise the other day, a mug emblazoned with "Make Epidemiologists Boring Again." I don't know. And apparently there's a t-shirt as well. I'm not sure. I didn't know that epidemiologists were boring at one stage, but anyway, there are obviously some who weren't enjoying the limelight. So, and of course, with a lot of talk about epidemiologists, you might be under the impression that there are lots of them around, and in fact, there aren't lots of them around, and particularly infectious disease epidemiologists. They're actually quite rare. There are very few in the country. Most of them are actually vets by background. Tricia's the real McCoy. She is an infectious disease epidemiologist, and you may be aware of the relatively large number of University of Otago staff who've contributed disproportionately to the national COVID response. Well, not all the efforts are widely known, and I just really want to acknowledge the role that Tricia's had. Amongst other things, she was seconded to the Ministry of Health as the Chief Clinical Advisor Epidemiology in the COVID-19 Health System Response Directorate for a large portion of the pandemic, and that was a critical role, I think largely behind the scenes, but it was an important one. So congratulations, Trish, my friend and colleague. Really well-deserved promotion, and I'm really looking forward to your lecture, and I'll hand over to Joe Baxter. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Nei rā, he mihi nui tēnei ki a koutou, ko rangi nui kei runga, ko papatuanuku kei raro, ko ngā tangata kei Wanganui. Ahakoa he mihi paku, he mihi aroha, he mihi nui tēnei ki a koutou. Well, kia ora everyone, and it is indeed a privilege to have been asked to introduce a peer and colleague, a fellow public health physician, Patricia Priest, for this, her inaugural professorial lecture, and it's fantastic, take 3, that we've actually made it today. And I feel really privileged as someone who has a public health background to be able to acknowledge and introduce Trish. And I suppose in thinking about how to introduce Trish, I'm aware that Trish's talk is about epidemiology, but epidemiology sits within that context of public health. And public health is the science and art of preventing disease, prolonging life, promoting health through the organised efforts and informed choices of society, organisations, communities and individuals. And I think if we've learned anything from COVID, we have seen all of those aspects of public health come to play. And I acknowledge that Trisha's path to becoming a professor truly embodies what it means to be a public health practitioner. And her talk today will give us a picture of that embodiment of public health practice within her academic journey. So a bit about Trish. Trish is a graduate from the University of Otago with her MBCHB. She has an MPH from Auckland and a DPhil from Oxford. So truly a spread academic journey. And Trisha's journey in public health medicine following training as a public health physician, Trisha's doctorate assessed the relationship between antibiotic prescribing and resistance in the community. Subsequently, she's worked in collaborative multidisciplinary research teams on a range of areas within public health epidemiology. Her research increases understanding of the transmission, prevention and control of infectious diseases in the community. This includes assessing public health interventions from a really broad range of areas, and it wasn't until I did this talk that I realised some of these things, and some of them are a little bit quirky. Hand sanitizer in primary schools, border screening for influenza, vitamin D supplementation for respiratory infections, chemoprophylaxis for leprosy, and household water filters in the Pacific. And I'm also aware you were aware of we're part of a research project that was nominated for an Ig Nobel Prize, I think, at some time. Other research aims to better understand bacterial carriage and transmission and identify modifiable risk factors for infection. Trish also has a range of other roles. She's currently our acting Pro-Vice-Chancellor. She's been a head of a department. She's a previous training program director for the New Zealand College of Public Health Medicine. And last year, very much as David has mentioned, was contributing epidemiology advice to the Ministry of Health's COVID-19 response as the Chief Clinical Advisor, Epidemiology, in the COVID-19 Health System Response Directorate. And I really do want to acknowledge Trish, and before welcoming her up to present her lecture, I would just like to finish with a whakatauki that I think is particularly relevant within the context of public health. Ma mua ka kite a muri, ma muri ka ao a maui. Those who lead give sight, those who follow give life to those who lead. And I really do want to acknowledge you, Patricia, and want to invite you up here to deliver your inaugural professorial lecture.
Well, that's pretty much it. You can go home now. Everything's been said. Right. Thank you, Joe. That was lovely. Tēnā koutou. Ko tēnei tāku mihi ki ngā tangata whenua o te rohe nei. No kōtiranga me airani nā tipuna o tōku pāpā, no ingarangi tōku mama. I tipu ake au ki ototahi e noho ana au ki Otipoti. Ko Trish Priest tōku ingoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, katoa. I want to start by thanking the university for giving me this opportunity to reflect on my life and career. I've had some lovely times looking back through our photo albums to find photos to scan, and thinking back about research projects that I've done and the interesting challenges and successes and the people I've worked with. So it's been a really nice thing to do. Ko waio, who am I, or who am I from? The old guy on this photo is George Priest, born in Unst in the Shetlands in 1825. He came out to New Zealand and walked from Wellington to Hawke's Bay with several of his adult sons to farm land, which I just want to take a moment to acknowledge was, I assume, taken from Ngāti Kahununu. The young boy in front is my grandfather, here seen with his wife Annie, my grandmother, who came to New Zealand from Ireland and married him just before he went off to fight in World War I. They had 4 children, very dour Presbyterians that they appear to be. And the boy at the front of that photo is my father, Hugh. He grew up and went to Canterbury University to study law, where he disappointed his parents by becoming interested in psychology and went on to get a PhD and be an academic. These are my maternal grandparents, Frank and Kathleen Usher, photographed in Bournemouth, and their English as far back as I know about. They had 2 children, my mother Audrey, we won't like this photo, I know, but I think it's really cute, and her brother David, and they immigrated to New Zealand when my mother was 13. She went to Marsden Collegiate and then university and did a BA, going on to be a secretary and disappointing her parents by falling in love with and marrying someone who wasn't wealthy, had no interest in being wealthy, and was opposed to private schooling. Later on, when I went to university, my mother went back and did a law degree, working as a clerk for the High Court judges in Christchurch and for the Inland Revenue Department for a number of years. 3 years after my parents married, I came along, and then my sister Julia. I showed an early tendency to want to look after sick teddy bears and to tell other people what to do. In my first year at university, I spotted this rather gorgeous young man, Hugh Forsyth, and 3 years later, yes, we were very young, we got married. 8 years after that, the first of our lovely children, Ella, arrived. She wasn't completely sure about how she felt about the arrival of Izzy 5 years later, here in the arms of our very good friend Joni. But 5 years after that, when Arlo came along, they were both apparently delighted. Just to bring us up to speed, up to the current day, my sister Julia did a botany degree and an MBA at Otago and is now a primary school teacher in Sydney. This is my mother recently in her happy place with our pets on the couch at home. And this is the Priest Forsyth gang now. Arlo has just finished a botany degree and is going to train as a high school teacher. Izzy is a professional firefighter, and Ella is an engineer who is currently working doing COVID transmission modelling. So, why an epidemiological lens? Well, I wanted to honour my father in this talk because he was the first influence on my career path. He was a psychologist whose research area was perception, and I have some lenses of his. And one day at lunch, my friend Claire and I did a bit of brainstorming and came up with this title for my talk because I wanted to have something nice as a prop in the inevitable photo. As it turns out, I used this rather than the lenses as a prop. I'm not sure what it is actually, but I think it's something to do with demonstrating light splitting or something, but I thought it was cool. This is my favourite photo of my father, friend to cats, reading or snoozing after dinner in the lounge of the house I grew up in. He worked in the Department of Psychology at the University of Canterbury for nearly 20 years. He was a well-loved teacher and published, as far as I can tell, 4 peer-reviewed papers in his whole career. It was a very different time. When I was in the 4th year of my medical degree, he dropped dead walking to work. One of his colleagues at his funeral giving the eulogy said, he was an analyst who could strip things to their bare essentials rapidly and with great exactness. Hugh Priest had many admirable qualities, but above all, he was a family man. The achievements of his wife and daughters were always on the tip of his tongue. He spoke of them often and with enormous affection and pride. In Hugh's life, they came first, and he did not care who knew it. As any of you who have had parents die, especially when you're relatively young, will know, I still grieve for him, and I mourn the fact that as I've grown up and ended up taking a similar path to his, I've not been able to benefit from his critical analytical abilities and discuss things of mutual interest, and nor have I had his love or support to lean on. I do know that he would be proud of me now, but also always, and I like to think that I may have inherited some of his admirable qualities. Through encouraging me to use my brain and pushing me to enter a profession so that I wouldn't need to be dependent for my livelihood on some man, he probably had the most important influence on my career path. So, epidemiology. I did have plans to do these really cool ways of bringing lenses and epidemiology in my life all together, and it just got too kind of contorted and cute, so I abandoned all that. But for the rest of this talk, I'm going to say a bit about how I ended up being an epidemiologist, tell you about some of the research I've done, and reflect a bit. I want to make the point right now that I do research in teams, and I'm not always the principal investigator. And also that I don't have a kind of thread that runs through my research where I wanted to investigate something and I did one study and then built on that and built on that. I've done lots of different things, and I've done so many interesting different things when I think about it, and I can't talk about all of them. So I've chosen a few which I think were important in my trajectory to where I am now. If you have worked with me and I don't include the study that you're a part of, I'm really sorry, I would have loved to, but please don't be offended. Teaching is also part of being a professor, and I'm not really talking about teaching. I had plans to, but yesterday morning I started with a talk that was 2 hours long, and I had to cut a whole lot of stuff out. I'm still probably a bit long. But anyway, when I started down here teaching, I did exactly what this blogger is talking about. I thought, epidemiology, people might think it's a bit dry. Start with something funny, lift the mood, and go from there. So I did Google epidemiology jokes, and I've never used this one in a talk, but I've always really liked it, so I'm using it now. I'm not going to teach you anything much about epidemiology, but I did just want to say a word about what it is, and thank you, Joe, for giving a definition of public health. That was not set up, but that was perfect. It gives us this context. And I was going to say something about how we're all epidemiologists now, but David's done that for me. The standard definition of epidemiology is that it's the study of the distribution and determinants of diseases or health states in populations and prospects for their control. And it's the quantitative underpinning of public health. So we use this slide in our introductory lectures on public health and epidemiology, or I certainly do. And it's a completely unrealistic, of course, representation of how we go about trying to address public health problems. It's never as linear and beautifully staged as that. There's often lots of things going on at once. But broadly, epidemiology is understood in two parts. One is descriptive, which is where we are identifying, or having decided what the public health problem we're talking about is, identifying who has it, where and when. People talk about person, place and time, and you've seen a lot of that in the pandemic, a lot of discussion of who's getting it. The other sort of part of epidemiology is analytical epidemiology, where you're asking this question broadly: why do some people get diseases and others don't? And that requires some very careful design of sometimes quite sophisticated studies and careful and sophisticated analyses. And I really beg you, if you're not an epidemiologist, to not try that at home. There's been a bit of that going on as well, which has been perhaps less useful. So, how did I end up being a professor of epidemiology? I started off as PP and now I'm PPP. It's not as straightforward as that. And in fact, nobody's life is as straightforward as that. And one of the things I've really enjoyed getting older, especially as my children started thinking about what they wanted to do with their lives, is realising that so many people who you meet who are doing interesting things have not had a straight line from when they left school to where they get now. It's never like that. Mine's felt a bit like this. So I'm going to just try and skip through some of the bits along the way of me becoming an epidemiologist. I went to school in Christchurch. As I said, I had university-educated parents. Oops, no, there we go. Had a good group of friends at school, and I'm delighted that two of these women, Susan and Kerry, are here today. I don't think we really thought we were going to be movie stars, but we quite like dressing up. Kerry and I were prefects and co-duxers at Christchurch Girls High School. And as I was getting through my schooling and thinking about what I wanted to do, I was thinking about these things, and I don't think I articulated them very well at the time to myself or anybody else, but I was strongly driven to want to do good in the world and help people, and I really enjoyed solving problems. Maths and physics were my strongest and favourite subjects, and those were the things I think that I needed out of a career. I thought, I should just say that as I was going through the photos, I just came across photos of all these interesting means of transport that we've had over the years, so I've just popped a few of them in the slides so that you can entertain yourself when what I'm saying isn't interesting. So I thought, well, medicine's doing good in the world and helping people. I have to say, with absolutely no disrespect to people in medicine who solve challenging intellectual and theoretical problems, that was not part of my thinking in terms of medicine. I was thinking it will be about doing good in the world and helping people, and that will be great. In my last year of school, I went on a trip to one of my friends' family's farm in Ashburton, and I was taken by the really clever ways that farmers solve problems, technical, practical, and get things done around the place. And I just thought it was so cool, some of the really nifty ways that they came up with solving problems. And I thought that would be really cool to be involved in doing that. And I read around and discovered there's this thing called agricultural engineering. And I thought, well, that's going to work for my interests in physics and maths, and it will be doing good in the world and helping people. So I thought maybe that's what I should do, and I went out to visit the course advisor at what was then Lincoln College, because it was a course run between engineering and Lincoln, and he was slightly perplexed to see me, and essentially said, well, you know, the thing is that girls don't really do this. And I went, oh, okay. I was a bit of a biddable person at that age, I think. I went back to the careers advisor at school and said, well, agricultural engineering isn't going to work out. What else do you suggest? And she said, but bride girls do medicine. And I said, oh, all right. And I went and had a chat with my GP about what it's like being a doctor and try to think about whether I would want to be a doctor. And he said, it's really hard to get in, you know. And I went, all right. And so I acknowledged that's probably not the ideal motivation, but the other motivations were still there in the background. At that time, you could get what was called preferential entry to medical school, where you were guaranteed a place, you just had to do first year and do whatever you like. I really regret that I wasted that opportunity to do some really interesting things like history and philosophy and political science that I could have done and I know I would have really enjoyed. But one thing I did do was a psychology course. My father wouldn't allow me to do the course which would enable me to go on and do a major in psychology because he was the head of department at the time and said if I wanted to study psychology I'd have to go to a different university. So I did the non-continuing course, which is where I spied that young man I mentioned earlier on, so that was worth it. So in 1981, I came down to Dunedin to be a second year medical student, and at the time Otago was facing a drop in enrolments, partly due to changes in the government support for students. So the marketing team put together a video intended to encourage people to come to Otago, and I'm just going to, oh no, that's not it. Oh, okay, it's not going to work. I thoroughly recommend looking up Learning as a Way of Life on YouTube. Hocken has digitised it. It's fantastic. I'm there for about half a second. But also it shows Salmond Hall, where I went to in my second year. And this is me in my preferred exam preparation position in my little room in Salmond Hall in second year. This is the class that I went into. And I'm showing it to you partly because it's nostalgic for me and I like seeing it, and partly because it was an important time for me in my journey towards epidemiology, because David Skegg had just come back, sorry I ripped your photo off the web somewhere, had just returned from Oxford and to be the Professor of Preventive and Social Medicine. And he taught us about epidemiology in second year, and I was just so taken with it. He talked about how you could figure out what caused disease by observing and thinking and doing clever studies without ever cutting anyone up and looking at them under a microscope. And I just thought it was amazing. And I believe that David's enthusiasm and communication skills were important in the fact that, it doesn't show up very well, does it? That 8 of our class went on to do public health medicine. So we have Lindley Cook, Peter Crampton, Jackie Fawcett, Bernie Mullen, Leanne Parkin, Di North, and that's me in the corner. And also Ishiro Kawachi, who's not in the photo. So that was 5% of our class going on to public health medicine, and I looked it up the other day. That compares with less than 1% of all New Zealand doctors who are public health medicine specialists. So that is a little bit of analytical epidemiology, comparing a group exposed to David's early teaching and with everybody. Doesn't hold up as an epidemiological study if you think about it for more than a second, but that was really pivotal for me. This guy, David Murdoch, didn't do public health medicine, but does have a master's in epidemiology from the London School of Hygiene. I'm not sure if we can credit that to David or not. David Skegg. Anyway, a few cars now. I went on to, where am I? I went on to do my, so what we call clinical school years in Christchurch, and did my first house surgeon year in Wellington. Nothing epidemiological happened there, so I'm not going to go on about that. That was Christchurch, that's Wellington. And then, as so many of our peers were able to do, Hugh and I went and did some overseas experience. We cycled in Greece and Ireland and in England. We bought a combi van, it's very stereotypical, and drove across Europe to Turkey and around a bit of Turkey, for some of the way accompanied by my mum. And in between times, I worked at a number of A&E departments in London as a locum, and also at Westminster Hospital, which is not a hospital anymore. But I did a number of locums in radiotherapy and oncology, which actually I really enjoyed, but to train in that would have taken a lot more years in a hospital. I didn't like working in hospitals, so that was not going to happen. But also while I was at Westminster, I met a public health medicine registrar who talked to me about what public health is, and the breadth of it, and the way that it tries to improve people's lives by changing things at higher levels than at the individual patient. And I just thought that was great. I'd also been very struck by, when doing A&E locums, by the extent to which failures of the system, like poor access to primary care, had such a big impact on people's health and their lives. And so we came back to New Zealand for me to train in public health medicine. I thought that I was going to go and run the health service better. That was my original intention. About 8 months before we left, we had Ella. And then we came back, and Ella was able to spend some time with her grandmothers. Hugh's mum was living in Auckland. And I set off on this public health medicine training, the first part of which is a Masters in Public Health with a compulsory paper in epidemiology. Robert Beaglehole taught me epidemiology, and he was at a point in his life and career where he was doing a lot of kind of thinking about not just what epidemiology is and how you can best use it, but what is public health, where does it fit in, what are we doing, is it good? And I loved those conversations, and realised, I guess, that epidemiology was really what I wanted to do, and that it would combine doing good in the world and helping people and solving interesting problems. Robert Beaglehole, I really loved the methods. I wanted to be a methodologist, but Robert Beaglehole said, no one will take you seriously as an epidemiologist unless you are first a world expert in a particular area of health from an epidemiological point of view. So you've got to find a disease you want to study. So I went, as I'm inclined to do, it seems. Anyway, my master's was supervised by Rod Jackson, who's had a bit of a profile over COVID. And I was the coordinator of a large descriptive study of cardiovascular risk factors in the Auckland population. So looking at who had, for example, high blood pressure, over what period and where. When we came back to New Zealand from the UK, Hugh and I had a bit of a deal that if he didn't find good work such as he'd had in London by the time I finished my training, we'd go back to the UK. And that indeed is what happened. I looked around for a way of us getting back there without it costing the fortune that we didn't happen to have on hand, and found a scholarship that I could apply for. And I got this Oxford Nuffield Medical Fellowship. We had Izzy. We couldn't go to Oxford shortly after she was born because they wouldn't let me go and study part-time while she was very small. We had to wait for a year before we were allowed to go. But off we went. We went without a PhD topic. I didn't have a PhD topic. I looked around for one. It turns out that in Oxford people are very busy, and unless there's something about you that's special, it's very hard to get people's attention. Being a qualified medical specialist, fully funded, was not special enough, and it took me a long time to find a PhD topic, and eventually someone pointed out to me that there was a New Zealander in our college who was a doctor, and I chatted to him and he said, I know an epidemiologist, and sent me off to see Roy Anderson, who was not an epidemiologist in the way that I had ever heard of it. He's a mathematical modeller of infectious diseases. But he was doing a big project on antibiotic resistance, and he had some mathematicians and physicists who were working on a big database of general practice records, but none of them were quite sure which of the drugs were antibiotics in that big database. And I came along and said, oh, I'm a doctor. So I ended up being supervised by Roy, and my advice to people thinking about a PhD is to find a supervisor who cares about you and your project and is not too busy to actually see you and help you along with it. It wasn't a terribly satisfactory supervision experience. And then I decided I had to find something I could do without help, and decided to do a study using routinely collected data, which then I discovered that it's really hard in England to get people to respond to your letters asking about their data if there's not something special about you and they don't already know you. But as it happens, Roy left Oxford while I was there, and I got a new supervisor, David Mant, who was co-trained in public health and primary care, and who got on the phone to some of his mates and said, how about giving this woman some of your data? And suddenly I had all the data I needed. David really got me through, and I am so grateful for that. He was very good at saying, stop, this chapter is good enough, and that was very important. So this is the project that I did. I'm not going to talk at length about any of my research, just very quick and high level. Sorry, I'm probably going to be too long. But I was interested in whether antibiotic taking of the people in your community was important for your risk of getting antibiotic resistant infections. Because there's a lot of focus on individuals taking antibiotics and then getting resistant infections, but actually, if you think about it, it's the people who are coughing on you or whatever, infecting you, it's probably their antibiotic taking that's important. So that's what I was interested in. I got, you wouldn't believe how much data and how long it took me to clean it and make it analysable. It seems like I can't believe how long it took, but it did take a long time. And I've got a number of analyses that look a bit like this, which is looking on the x-axis at this one's general practices and the amount of prescribing of a particular antibiotic, and this is the resistance of particular bugs that came from those practices, and you can see there's actually very little, there's no relationship really. This is when you group them into bigger geographical groups, which I hoped might better represent the community people live and work in. There's slightly less scatter, but there's a lot less data. So really, my conclusion was that in the UK at that time, the focus on trying to get GPs to stop prescribing as many antibiotics was not going to deliver us reductions in antibiotic resistance that people thought it would. I was born relatively soon before we came back to New Zealand. So I was going to say, after doing this study, I felt like I could call myself an epidemiologist. We came back home after this initially to Auckland, where it was made clear that no one there really thought there was any particular point in infectious disease epidemiology. And I didn't do much research there, although I did work on the cervical cancer audit, which was looking at the screening program and how well it was doing, where I met Sue Kringle, who I believe is either online or is going to watch this later, and who's now down here, and that was great. Then at the end of 2005, I came down to Otago, where I am forever grateful for the very collegial welcome I received, and I really felt when I was here that if I was working well, doing my best, that I would be valued, and it wasn't necessary to be bringing in multi-million-dollar grants every week before anyone would think that you were okay, and that was a relief and really good. Shortly after I got here, I was invited to a meeting organised by Michael Baker. Sorry. It's all right. Where he was bringing together a bunch of people doing infectious disease research at Otago, most of them not epidemiologists. And he was getting together, as he's so good at, several groups of people to propose projects for a big funding stream from CDC in the US. And Lance Jennings and I put together the application for this study, trying to see whether screening people for symptoms as they came into the country would keep a pandemic influenza out. So there was a lot of concern about a new pandemic. This was around 2007. Alistair Duncan there was our very well organised and enthusiastic study coordinator who also did his masters. We had a big team, and one of the team on the days when flights were coming into and then out of Christchurch from Australia would head down to the airport at about 4 o'clock in the morning and hand over a pack of these questionnaires, which were designed to be the same size as an arrivals card, to the aircrew, who would then hand them out on the flight back to New Zealand. And as people arrived into Christchurch, they would see these notices and have our lovely research assistants asking them to give their questionnaires back. And as they gave them back, the research assistants checked whether they had ticked any of the boxes for symptoms, and whether they had a particular marked card. And if you had the marked, there was a random selection of cards to mark. If you had a marked card or you had symptoms, you are invited to come and have some measurements taken in this little corner of the arrivals hall. Have their temperature taken, had a swab. For a period we were doing thermal scanning. And we got questionnaires back from about nearly 16,000 travellers. which was 68% of the people arriving through at that time. 17% reported at least one symptom, although the prevalence of so-called influenza-like illness, which is much tighter, was lower than that. We got about 3,800 respiratory specimens and estimated that the prevalence of influenza among those arriving travellers, so this was winter 2007 or 8, was about 1%. Our conclusion was that, and this is kind of interesting in the light of, well, I think it's interesting in the light of recent events, we concluded that screening for symptoms to keep influenza out of New Zealand was not going to be worthwhile. You would end up having to take swabs and ask to quarantine a very large number of people, and yet most of the people who actually had influenza up their noses would not have been picked up. So we decided it wasn't going to be a useful strategy. Obviously this was influenza, and this influenza in particular. I went on to do the study that Joe mentioned about hand sanitizer in primary schools, where we found that we randomised 68 primary schools and got them to get the kids to use hand sanitizer on the way out to lunch and play. It did not reduce winter illness absences, which was what we'd been hoping it would do. But I was sitting in my office one day when the phone rang, and it was someone who I had seen only occasionally since medical school, who said, "We're going to do a trial of vitamin D in respiratory illness. Do you want to be part of it?" And I said, it's quite, as David mentioned, it's quite isolated. Being an infectious disease epidemiologist in New Zealand, there aren't that many of us. And I thought, this is great. And I said yes. And we did this study on vitamin D supplementation and respiratory infections. With all due respect to everyone involved, this wasn't the most methodologically interesting study I've been involved in. It was an individually randomised controlled trial. It was a lot of work to make it happen. It was in the context of a big vitamin D research industry taking off, finding or claiming that vitamin D would cure or prevent almost anything. So it was really useful to be able to find that in otherwise healthy adults, vitamin D supplementation did not reduce winter respiratory infections. But what the study really did was to link me up with a multidisciplinary team who worked on infectious diseases. And that has enabled me to continue to be an infectious disease epidemiologist. So this is the team from that study. But I went on to work with members of the team on Legionnaire's disease, where we found that keeping compost away from your face is really important, and that there's a lot more Legionnaire's disease out there than we previously thought. With Steve Chambers on leprosy in the Pacific, including a really interesting modelling study done by Charlotte Gilkison, a really great master's student. And as I say, having that connection with a group of people to work with made it possible for me to continue to do what I wanted to do. And it led on to this group, One Health Aotearoa, which includes environment, animal and human health people. Nigel French is a veterinary epidemiologist, and I've really enjoyed working with him as well. Just a brief note about being the Chief Clinical Advisor Epidemiology at the Ministry of Health. This is not part of my academic career, but it was made possible by being an infectious disease epidemiologist. And it was so interesting and so useful, and I really do think that people who are academics in public health should spend time working in the places where their research is being used to make policy, or research in their area is being used to make policy, to see how it's done, to meet the people who do it, and to try to help. My role was, a lot of it was working with modellers, trying to explain what the models meant to the decision makers in the ministry and elsewhere, trying to help the modellers understand what the questions the ministry wanted to ask really were, reviewing and commenting on the reports, a bit of managing expectations. There's this kind of magical thinking that's grown up around modelling that modelling can answer all of our questions and that whatever modelling says is the answer to our questions. And the modellers know that neither of those things are true, but it requires a bit of management of expectations among some of the people wanting to use them. One of the reasons for just mentioning this is that I was part of a modelling steering group, which was a multi-agency group, including Treasury, Stats New Zealand, Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Health, and the modellers themselves. And we met very frequently by Zoom, and actually this was one of the most intellectually stimulating experiences I've had for a really long time. It was a group of people all enthusiastic, interested, nutting things out, having robust discussions about what was going on, what needed to go on, and it was really fabulous. I'm really glad that I did that. And the final study that I'm going to talk about is one that's also already been mentioned, which is the study of socks over shoes to prevent you from sliding on the ice. So you may or may not know that many, possibly most, health researchers have a secret ambition to get into the British Medical Journal Christmas edition, where the British Medical Journal publishes methodologically sound studies on slightly unusual topics that they don't usually publish on, and they're often slightly humorous. And so one day in the tea room in Preventive and Social Medicine, after there'd been some suggestion by the council that people should put socks on over their shoes to stop them slipping, a group of us thought we could do a study of that and try and get into the Christmas BMJ. And so we did a study which we randomised people at the top of an icy slope to have socks on over their shoes or not, and we collected information at the bottom about how slippery they had found it, and we watched to see if they fell over. And we found that indeed putting socks on over your shoes does prevent you slipping down icy paths. And we were too late for the Christmas BMJ. They have a really early closing date. But we published it in the New Zealand Medical Journal. And rather than the joy of a Christmas BMJ, we received the Ig Nobel Prize for Physics in 2010. So the Ig Nobel Prizes are prizes for research that makes you laugh and then makes you think. And better than the Christmas BMJ, we got a photo of Leanne and a photo of my feet with socks on over my shoes in the BMJ that year. So that was cool. Oh, here's a picture of Sheila, who was the other key, the biostatistician who was the other key member of the team. Right, nearly there. So I just wanted to come back to this business of how I ended up as a professor of epidemiology. And just to show you that wiggly line I showed you was me trying to trace the travel that I've done as part of becoming a professor of epidemiology. And this is just a illustration of how incredibly, might say lucky, but I'm going to say privileged I've been to have this journey towards being a professor of epidemiology. And I'm going to show you, I don't think this is going to work. I've tried so many ways to do this, I can't tell you clever epidemiological biostatistical ways to show this, but I'm going to show this, which is a graphic of the relationship between a whole lot of different things. And these are used when you're trying to work out about causation of disease, and there's lots of components, and you're trying to go, well, this is important, but it's also related to that, which is related to this, and that's related to the outcome, and this is related to the outcome. And you draw this up, and then there are ways of figuring out from there how the analysis should be done to take into account things that might affect the relationship between the exposure and the outcome, but without putting too many of them in your statistical model. So I tried to do this for things that I thought affected me in my journey to becoming a professor. And when you read stories about people who are successful, you often you might hear about them being very clever. You might hear about them having supportive mentors, achieving a lot, having an excellent education, working hard, and all those things, pertain. You may hear about their parents, and obviously, I had tertiary educated parents, you don't necessarily hear about some of the other things. And so I've put up the top there, tried to encapsulate underprivilege, all of the things that I have had because I am a middle class Pākehā New Zealander, growing up in Christchurch. You know, I got to go to great schools because that's who I was. There are ways in which my education and achievements are because that's who I was. You know, my initial period in Oxford was really hard, but what solved it? It was a link that I had with somebody that I wouldn't have had if I wasn't me. And so I just want to acknowledge that I'm happy. I'm happy with my achievements. I'm happy with where I've got to. I'm proud of myself, but I'm also very aware that it's not just me, and that the kind of society that I would like to live in does not privilege people because of who they are when they're born. That's public health, kind of. Anyway, just to almost finish, I've added to my list of things I want to do good in the world and help people solve challenging problems and work with people I like working with, and that's been increasingly a focus for me, and I absolutely recommend it as a way of choosing the things that you do. So I've learned that individual mentors and supporters open doors, and that's great, but it also perpetuates the networks that we have of people who look after each other, and that's a problem if you want to have a truly equal society. I've learnt that an environment that facilitates successful team building is one that I want to be in, and that in public health, epi research relationships, broad relationships are absolutely crucial. I went to university at a time where I didn't pay fees and I got allowances from the government, and I'm incredibly grateful for that. I am grateful that I was funded by the Public Health Medicine Training Program to train in public health medicine, and that the Nuffield Foundation funded my DPhil at Oxford. Got a couple of sort of standard slides for acknowledgements for those two studies that I mentioned in particular. And I want to finish with these pictures of people I haven't mentioned but who've been important in my academic journey. They're roughly ordered by when I first met them, sort of. They are co-researchers, they're supporters and mentors, and they're friends. I have a whole lot of other people who've been important in my life, and I could have gone on, believe me, to tell you the really interesting stories about all those people. But I've tried to restrict myself here to the ones who've been important, particularly to my academic journey. So in summary, I've not been driven by following a passion to do a particular thing. I've probably been too influenced by advice from people early on in the journey. I'm happy where I got to, but agricultural engineering would have been kind of cool as well. I'm not particularly focused. I've done work in lots of different things, and that's cool. I've actually done a lot of studies which have had null findings, in other words, found no effect of the exposure or the intervention on the outcome, and that's good. It's good to know when things don't work, especially in the context of people pushing them. I've made choices based on things that looked interesting, and as I said, increasingly on who I want to work with. I'm not going to get a National Research Medal or Teaching Award, but I've had an interesting career and I've really enjoyed it, and I look forward to continuing to enjoy it for an as yet undetermined amount of time into the future. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Wow, kia ora koutou. For somebody who promised to deliver a very long lecture, that was actually remarkably to time, Trish, so thank you. My name's Neil Gemmell. I'm the Acting Deputy Pro-Vice-Chancellor of Health Sciences. It's quite the mouthful. And it's actually a very humbling job I have, which is to thank Trish for her insightful lecture. And I want to touch on a number of points that she has raised this evening. First, I just want to say that third time's the charm, I believe. I felt I had to get a cliche in there somewhere. And I'm so glad that you've had it now, because I get to make this vote of thanks. So that was a very well delivered, insightful lecture with a very good sense of humour. Plus, for me as a car aficionado, I've now recognised that you're a Citroen lover, and seem to have collected many of them over the years. I'm betting you probably wish you still had them, because they're now worth a fortune. You still got one? Oh, well, that's good to know. Can I borrow it? Anyway, cars aside, I just wanted to reflect that as a public health expert and an epidemiologist, you've delivered a lot of good to the world. And I want to also acknowledge that sometimes that good comes in the shape of knowing what doesn't work, because that's incredibly important as we go forward and try to find interventions that do, and avoid us wasting time on interventions that don't. You know, things like trying to inject bleach, that sort of thing. Not to be recommended. I, as a geneticist, was intrigued by some of the things that you drew parallels with, because I've worked on some of these things too, it turns out. Antibiotic resistance, which is important. Influenza, which of course a decade ago or so we thought was probably going to be the next pandemic. It could well be the pandemic after this one, sorry to be the doom and gloom merchant. And I remember working on swine flu and bird flu at the time, which I'm sure that's what you were doing. And I'm fairly sure, probably quite a few of us were participants in your study at some juncture around about 2007, 2008. I seem to recall that. I also seem to recall being terrified of going through Hong Kong, where they would stick a thing in your ear, and I thought, oh God, I'm going to get stuck here or something like that at some point. But fortunately it never happened. But thank you very much for that really important public health work, which has helped keep us better and safer. I don't know if you're involved with the flu tracking project, but that's religiously undertaken in my family every Monday morning, and that's a really important piece of work too. So those sorts of data I think are interesting. I do recall, as I first arrived at Otago, the socks and slips study that you were involved with. I can vouch that it does work, and occasionally I probably should have used it more frequently than I have indeed at times. About 6 weeks ago I had a really bad slip. If I'd been wearing socks over my shoes, I think that may not have happened. Hindsight's 20/20. You said at the beginning of your lecture and towards the end that you wanted to do good in the world and help people, and you have. Very much so. What you didn't really cover very much is how you have helped others through their academic journeys as a teacher, mentor and leader. And that's something that I think we want to acknowledge here at the University of Otago. You also mentioned that your father had enormous affection and pride for you and your family. And I'm sorry that he is not with us this evening, and I acknowledge the hurt that you'll feel. But we have enormous affection and pride for you, Trish, at the University of Otago. And as your extended academic whānau, we just want to wish you all the very best for this important moment in your life, and we're very grateful to be able to share it with you. I'll draw to a close now and ask you to join with me in thanking Trish for an inspiring lecture. I do have a small gift to to bestow upon you from the university. All right, almost done. So the last job I have this evening is to invite you all to join with us to celebrate further with Trish over drinks and snacks at the staff club. I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you.